It's time for our next teaching reflection on the kingdom. And we left off in our last video in Matthew 13. And we had just gotten done talking about the parable of the soils. And we said we're going to be launching into this little trip through these parables. And these parables have these really clear and strong opportunities to teach us about the kingdom. And they don't teach us in our Western ways. Like, these parables aren't a blog post that give us 3 points and a really nice, clean, mechanical explanation, a formula for, living as God intends in the world. They're much more poetic. They're much more, in some cases, abstract, in many cases, more concrete. But they're not as direct. They're indirect, and that's where the teaching has more power, has more legs to be able to go places and teach us through our ability to reflect. And so this whole little video series that we're doing on YouTube, this journey, we're asking about what is the kingdom of God, what can we learn about the kingdom of God, and how we're supposed to live. So that's going to drive our reflection. Maybe a little different for those of you that have listened to the podcast and you've gotten all the way into session 3, and you're going to hear a lot of overlap in the material, but maybe what we're trying to reflect on is slightly different, and that may change some of our takeaways. So probably a shorter conversation today. All I want to do is focus. I don't want to take too many parables at a time, because each parable is going to give us something to really think about and reflect on, and we don't want to cram too much of that into the same space. And so today I want to look at the parable of the weeds, and the parable of the weeds and the wheat. Now, this parable kind of has 2 parts, and in the middle sits the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast in the dough, the woman and her dough. And so we're going to do the seed and the yeast in the next video, and I'm just going to focus on the 2 parts, the parable of the weeds and the wheat, and then where Jesus is asked to explain the parable. That's the part I want to look at today. And I think just it's not going to be complicated. It's going to be a very simple lesson, and yet one that is really, really difficult, I feel like, for us to accept and learn. Those of us that would call ourselves Christians and probably have belonged in that space for some time. So here we go. I got the old NIV today. If it sounds a little funny, it's because it's the NIV 1984. All right, but let's see here. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, the weeds also appeared. The owner's servant came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come? Where did the weeds come from?" "My enemy did this. An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling up the weeds, you may also root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, and then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Okay, so first, that's the first part. It's part A. And some of the context, I'll link the podcast episode where we talk about this. I'll link that in the description to the video. But part of the context of this is that in that area of the ancient world, the ancient Near East, you have wheat, and then there's a weed that commonly grows up. It'll sometimes be called tares. And most people are going to identify that as what's sometimes called bastard wheat. A tare is a weed, but it looks like wheat. It has from a distance, you can't tell when you're looking at the field. It all kind of looks the same. And it's not until harvest where it becomes more obvious, because when harvest time comes, the wheat the heads of grain get heavy enough that the wheat bows over, but the tare, the weed, the bastard wheat, actually, it never bows over. It just stands straight up. And at that point, you can see and you can tell. So there's like this literal, historical, scientific context behind the story that I think most of the audience and Matthew's audience and Jesus's audience is catching. They understand it's not just like, oh, there's dandelions growing in the wheat. There's weeds in wheat, and it's really hard when we look out. We can see that there's weeds. Do you want us to go pull it up? And in the parable, the owner says, no, don't do that, because you may pull up. It's hard to tell the difference between the two, right? I would also point out here that in this parable, what was it, the last video, 2 videos ago, 3 videos ago, we talked about the 2 and 3 part eschatology in the conversation between John the Baptist and Jesus. And now you see that very clearly at play here, right? That 2 or 3 part eschatology, where John is really promoting in his theology a 2-part eschatology, the age of this world and the age to come, and there's a clean break. And Jesus here in his parable and his theology very clearly teaching a 3-part. There is a period where weeds and wheat grow together. In John's world, there's a period. There's the age of the weeds, and then there's the age of the wheat, but they don't grow together. But in Jesus' theology, there is an era, an age where the 2 grow together. All right. So then later, Jesus is asked a few verses later. He does the parable of the soils. He does the parable of the weeds. He does the parable of the mustard seed, and the parable of the seed, and the parable of the yeast. And then they go inside, and the disciples ask Jesus, explain that parable to us. So he does a bunch of public teaching, and then he leaves that public area, goes somewhere else, and the disciples went in a more private space, go, can you go back to the parable on the weeds again? So he left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. He answered, the one who sowed good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the sons of the kingdom, which, by the way, is a phrase that the Essenes used. Sons of the kingdom, or sometimes the sons of light. That's what the Essenes called those that walked in righteousness, those that were a part of the kingdom, right? The sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. So the first thing Jesus does is he just kind of identifies the pieces of the parable. He says, I want to make sure I don't miss anything. Let's see here. The man who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. Okay, so the sower is the Son of Man. The field is the world. Thanks for that explanation. The good seed is for people that are a part of the kingdom. The bad seed is people who aren't a part of the kingdom, and the one that sows them is the devil. Okay. And the harvest is the end of the age. So there is this 3-part eschatology, and the harvest is this point over here where God comes, or the sower, you could say the Son of Man comes to get rid of the weeds, to get rid of the evil, right? As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. So there will come a day, Jesus says, where God will make everything right and evil will be done away with. The weeds are an intruder. Evil is an intruder. It's not what belongs in the world. It's an intruder, and it will be dealt with and done away with. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. So the Son of Man will send out his angels, and they're going to get rid of everything that doesn't belong. They will then throw them into the fiery furnace. Interesting reference for anybody that's gone through our podcast and knows about Pardes, which we'll probably talk about in the next video. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Where there will be a weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Feels like another reference. He who has ears, let him hear. Now, we love to take that explanation, the part B. So we did part A and then we did part B. We love to take part B and just get all worked up trying to make that work and talk about the mechanics of eschatology and how the end times works and what happens and what about heaven and hell and all that kind of stuff and who's the wicked, and we get so wrapped up in part B and trying to understand that we miss the very clear, direct, and blatant point of the actual parable in part A. Because the point of the parable is that, I'll read that last paragraph. So this is going back to part A. This is verse 29. No, he answered them. They said, do you want us to go pull up the weeds? No, he answered them, because while you're pulling up the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds, and put them in bundles to be burned, and then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. So the point of the parable is very clearly, leave the weeds and the wheat discernment. I will deal with the weeds, God says, the Son of Man says. That is not your job. It's not your job because it's not time yet, and you can't tell. You don't have the perspective that's needed. You may get it right sometimes. You may even get it right most of the time, but you're going to get it wrong. And you're going to pull up wheat that you think is a weed. You are not capable of doing this work. You leave that work to me. Jesus very clearly says in that parable. What is the kingdom like? What are we supposed to learn about the kingdom? Well, the kingdom is a place that's the kingdom. When you find the kingdom in this world, it's never like this pure, unblemished, unadulterated. When you find the kingdom in this world that you and I live in right now, prior to Jesus coming back, when you find the kingdom in this world, it's always going to have weeds in it. Always. Yeah, it's a guarantee. It's the reality. To use Jesus' language, the devil has come and sowed weeds in the middle of everything. There will never be a pure, unblemished pocket of kingdom. If we're reflecting on this parable, trying to say, what can we learn about the kingdom and what it means to live in the kingdom? What can we learn about the kingdom? That the kingdom is never going to be this pure, unblemished thing. There is always going to be weeds in the kingdom that you encounter, that you and I interact with every day. In churches that we have, in ministries that we pursue, in our families, in our own selves and our own walks of righteousness. We're not going to have pure, unblemished perfection. There's going to be weeds. You're going to find weeds in the midst of the wheat everywhere. What does it mean to live in kingdom? Let it be. Let it be. Do not go weeding. And I know that is unbelievably difficult for us because we do not do that. Those of us that have been trained in seminary and Bible college and lead churches and lead nonprofits, we think it's somehow our job, that a part of stewardship is to do the weeding. And in this parable, one of the things we're taught, and maybe there are some other complexities, there's always complexities and nuances, and I get that, and there's other conversations we have, but we do not grapple enough with the fact that what Jesus says in this parable is, in the kingdom you will have weeds, and that is not your responsibility. God says it's my responsibility, and I will deal with it when it's harvest time. But if you go deal with it right now, you're going to screw up the harvest. Man, that is a powerful lesson to me. We meddle. We step into the God character. Man, especially as for those of us that are American Christians, we don't like somebody else being in that seat. By that seat, I mean God's seat, like God's throne. We don't like anybody. That's not what America does. Like America, we love to we are in charge. We make the decisions. We work on behalf of God. And we don't like lessons where we're told, not your job. Not your job. Somebody else's job. Somebody else's job. So what are you saying, Marty? There's no... 1 Corinthians 5, Paul says to expel the immoral. Yeah, I get it. Yeah. But it is not our job to go through and weed the garden. And we do this all the time. The amount of emails that I field every single week because I quoted that teacher or I recommended that book. It's obviously a weed. It's obviously a weed. Is it? Do we know that? How do we make that call? There are some other teachings here that become really relevant, by the way. Teachings like you'll know a tree by its fruit. So it's not that we have to just sit back and well, I can't discern between light and darkness. I can't engage between weeds and no. Of course we can. Of course, critical thinking. Of course, there are things that are wrong. They're wrong. They're falsehood. Of course, there are things. Of course, yes. Of course, we have to think critically, and of course, there are things that have to be rejected. That's not what we're talking here. It's about how we love to categorize. This is in. This is out. This is unblemished wheat, ready to be taken to the barn. And this is bundles of weeds that needs to be thrown into the fiery furnace. But it's not harvest time yet. And so it's not time to bundle them up. And the truth of the matter is it's impossible to tell the difference accurately and effectively before harvest. We need to wait to harvest so we can see things as they actually are. So just let it be God. So one of the things that Jesus tries to teach us in the kingdom is that the kingdom is a place where you're going to find light and darkness together. You're going to find weeds and wheat together. The kingdom is going to be a place that's not this pure, unblemished, unadulterated refuge of holiness. The kingdom's always going to have this stuff that's got stuff in it. Be about the task of engaging the work of the kingdom. Don't try to weed out everything first. Just lean into the good and let the good press us forward. Let the good pull us towards that eschaton, the thing that the fulfillment of the culmination of the age. Let God do his work, because along the way, in between here and there, we might find out that some of that stuff actually turns into wheat. It looked like weeds. It looked like a tear. But when I gave it enough time and enough sun and enough water and when I cultivated my field, when I just pursued good farming practices, well, it turned out that stuff was actually wheat the whole time, and I didn't know it. I would have misjudged it. When you're in the kingdom, just pursue the kingdom. Pursue the things of the kingdom. Invite other people to come along. And we all might be surprised by the time the story is over, who ends up being a part. I mean, doesn't this go back to what we just talked about 5 videos ago? The Feast of Abraham. The agenda of Matthew isn't one of the things that we keep learning over and over again about the kingdom is you're going to be surprised about who's there. Isn't this the exact same lesson? We can't be trusted with the job of weeds and wheat harvesting, because we're going to be surprised at who the weed are. We're going to be surprised at what the weeds look like. We're going to be surprised. Because it's not our kingdom. It was always God's kingdom. So we'll let God and his angels and his harvesters. And Marty, how does that work? And what does that look like? And what about the judgment day? And that wasn't the point of the parable. The point of the parable is, let God do that. He's got his harvesters. He's got his agenda. He's got his kingdom. He's got it. It's his harvest. He's got his barns. And when it comes harvest time, he's still not going to ask you to do it. Even when it's harvest time, he's still not going to ask me to go do the harvest. I've got my harvesters, God says. I got that. I don't need you to do my harvesting. I've got harvesters. They're already on retainer. I got it. I'll take care of the harvest. Don't you worry about it. Just help me be a part of the kingdom. Just help me grow my field. All right? I'll take care of the weeds. You don't have to. Even at the end, he's not going to ask you to be it's such a refreshing, challenging, because I want to be, I want to help make that decision. I want to be the one that discerns. That's a weed. And God says if you would have just given it 3 more months, you would have seen it was a nice It was a nice head of grain. It was a nice piece of wheat. But you didn't think so. You thought it was a weed. Anyway, I'm just waxing eloquent now, and not even very well. But those are my thoughts. That's my reflection for the parable of the weeds and what we can learn from the kingdom. It will not be a pure, unblemished place. And it's not our job to fix that. It's our job to live. Be wheat. Concern yourself with being wheat. Do that. And the kingdom will move forward. I'll look forward to the next time. We'll get into the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast in the dough. Talk to you then.